It started with a call no father ever forgets. A trembling voice on the other end said only 8 words. "Dad, my back hurts. I can't hold Jonah anymore." In that moment, Jack Carter, a veteran who had faced war zones and chaos, felt something colder than fear. Instinct took over. He left his mission, climbed into his truck with his loyal dog Rex, and raced straight toward the home where his 2 children were waiting. But what awaited him behind that familiar door wasn't just pain or exhaustion. It was a truth darker than any battlefield. A story not about war, but about love, neglect, and the cost of silence. Before we begin, remember to like and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Leave your country in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories can travel. The late afternoon sun hung low over the quiet outskirts of Willow Creek, spilling its amber light across fields of dry grass and rows of suburban houses that glowed like embers before the night. Jack Carter stood beside his aging pickup, the air thick with dust and the faint scent of pine carried on a western wind. He was 42, his face lined not just from years of service, but from the kind of fatigue that comes from remembering too much. The olive-green jacket he always wore still bore a faint smell of gun oil and rain. At his side moved Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat and a black saddle marking across his back, tan chest and legs, his amber eyes sharp yet loyal. Together, they were part of a community outreach program, retired soldiers helping to train local search and rescue units. But today, the world around them felt unusually still, as if something unseen were about to change. The sound of the phone broke the silence. Jack pulled it from his pocket, his hand instinctively steady, the way it had always been in combat. But the moment he heard his daughter's trembling voice, all that steadiness vanished. "Dad, my back hurts. I can't hold Jonah anymore." The small, strained words were followed by the clatter of something falling, the muffled cry of a baby, then nothing, only the thin hiss of the line before it went dead. For a moment, Jack stood frozen under the dying light, the world narrowing into one single realization. Something was terribly wrong. He didn't think. He didn't need to. His instincts, the same ones that had once saved lives on distant battlefields, roared back to life. He swung into the driver's seat, Rex leaping beside him with a low whine as the truck engine groaned awake. The tires bit into the gravel as they tore down the road, scattering a trail of dust behind them. Jack's heart pounded with a cold, precise rhythm, 1 beat for every mile between him and his home. He called Marilyn, his second wife, his voice clipped and urgent. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. On the 3rd attempt, the screen flashed unreachable. A thin vein of dread coiled in his gut. He pressed harder on the accelerator, the speedometer climbing, the world around him a blur of fading orange and oncoming night. As the truck crested the final hill overlooking Willow Creek, the first lights of town flickered on, small glowing squares that should have meant safety, but now looked distant and cold. The house stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, its porch light glowing like a watchful eye. Jack pulled over, killed the engine, and listened. Even the crickets were silent. Rex's ears twitched, a low growl rolled from his throat. That was all the confirmation Jack needed. He pushed open the car door and ran. The front door of the house was ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges, and a thin stream of light spilled from within. Inside, the smell hit first. Sour milk, detergent, something metallic beneath it. The floor was slick, scattered with broken glass and overturned dishes. His boots left wet prints as he stepped through the hallway. "Emily?" His voice cracked, barely a whisper. "Sweetheart?" From the kitchen came a small sound, not quite a word, a child's soft whimper, the kind that pulls something primal out of a father's chest. Jack moved toward it, every step heavy, every breath loud in his ears. Rex followed, tail low, nose close to the floor, alert. Emily was there, kneeling on the kitchen tiles, her small hands gripping a towel, dragging it across the wet floor that shimmered under the ceiling light. She was 7, tiny for her age, with fine blonde hair clinging to her damp forehead and the faint pallor of exhaustion dulling her face. Across her narrow back, faint bruises darkened beneath the collar of her shirt, like the shadows of burdens she should never have carried. On her shoulder clung Jonah, the 6-month-old baby boy, his cheeks red and tear-streaked, his little fists clutching her neck as though he feared falling into the emptiness below. For a second, Jack could not breathe. When Emily looked up and saw him, her eyes widened and all the tension in her small body seemed to collapse at once. "Dad." The word was more exhale than sound. Jack dropped to his knees beside her, the cold water soaking into his jeans, and pulled her close. Jonah whimpered between them, the small weight of him pressed against Jack's chest. "Where's Marilyn?" he asked, his voice trembling despite his effort to keep it calm. Emily hesitated, her lower lip quivering. She left this morning. She said I had to finish all the chores before she got back. She said if I didn't, we wouldn't get dinner." Jack's jaw tightened, his breath coming slow and controlled, though his pulse thundered in his ears. He looked around the room, the sink piled with dishes, the floor half cleaned, the bottle on the counter half empty. Rex paced behind him, restless, sensing the storm beneath his master's silence. Emily's small shoulders shook as she tried to continue wiping the floor. "I didn't want the house to be messy," she whispered, "so Mommy wouldn't get mad." The word Mommy hung in the air like a ghost, foreign, misplaced, not the sound of affection, but of fear learned too young. Jack lifted her easily, the way he used to when she was little, and would fall asleep on the couch waiting for him to come home from deployment. But this time, she didn't rest her head on his shoulder. She stayed tense, her arms wrapped protectively around Jonah. Her body was light, frighteningly so. He could feel the faint tremor in her muscles, the heat of her skin from overexertion. "It's okay now," he murmured. "You don't have to do anything else." He carried her to the couch, laid both children down, and brushed the hair from Emily's face. Her eyes, fluttered closed, half in relief, half in sheer exhaustion. He dialed emergency services with one hand, his other resting on Jonah's small back as the baby's breathing steadied. The operator's voice blurred into the background of his thoughts, questions, confirmations, the promise of help on the way. Jack's gaze drifted around the room again, the toppled chair, the empty bottle of cleaner, the faint imprint of a woman's shoe by the back door. Everything suddenly fit into a picture he didn't want to see, a picture of neglect painted in silence and routine. Rex sat by the doorway, watching his master's face, his amber eyes steady, waiting for the next command. But there was none. Not tonight. The ambulance lights painted the front yard red and blue as the medics arrived. Jack followed them outside, Jonah cradled in his arms, Emily bundled in a blanket. The night air was cool, smelling faintly of rain and gasoline. He watched as they examined his daughter under the harsh fluorescent lights, their calm professionalism breaking only in the brief glance they exchanged, a look that told him she'd been carrying more than a child. She'd been carrying a household on her small back. When they lifted her onto the stretcher, she stirred faintly, her eyes opening just enough to find his. "Dad." "I'm sorry," she whispered. Jack bent close, his voice barely audible. "You have nothing to be sorry for." At the hospital, the sterile light and antiseptic smell pressed down on him. He stood beside the bed where Emily slept, her tiny hand wrapped in gauze, a band across her back supporting the muscles strained from overwork. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with gentle eyes, explained in measured tones that the injuries were not from a single fall but from repeated strain, a pattern of exhaustion over many days. "She needs rest," the doctor said, "and she needs someone here with her. No child should be doing what she's been doing." Jack nodded silently, his eyes fixed on the slow rise and fall of Emily's chest. Jonah slept in the nursery beside her, small and peaceful, unaware of the storm that had just passed. When the room finally quieted, Jack sat by the window, staring into the night that stretched beyond the glass. The city lights flickered on the horizon, but he saw none of them. In his mind, replayed the last moments of the call, the sound of her voice breaking, the thud, the cry. He thought of Marilyn's silence, the unreachable phone, the way she had once smiled when they first met, how he mistook control for composure, charm for care. He rubbed his temples and felt the weight of guilt settling deeper than any wound he'd carried from the battlefield. Rex lay curled by the doorway of the hospital room, head resting on his paws, eyes half open but vigilant. Jack looked at the dog, at the loyalty that never faltered, and felt the faintest spark of steadiness return. He leaned back in the chair, his hand finding the cold metal of his dog tag beneath the olive jacket, a habit he never lost, a reminder of promises made long ago. Tonight, the war he was fighting was no longer out there in the desert or the ruins of another land. It was here, inside walls painted soft and white, where the quiet could hurt more than the noise. And as the machines beside his daughter hummed softly, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This time, he wasn't leaving the fight unfinished. By the next morning, the night had thinned into a pale gray dawn as Jack drove back to Willow Creek. The last traces of sunset still lingered on the horizon, fading into the chill of early light. The world outside his windshield was silent, too silent, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Emily and Jonah were resting safely at the hospital, and for the first time in years, Jack was returning to an empty home, not as a soldier, but as a father who had seen too much in a single night. Rex lay quietly in the back seat, his amber eyes open, following every passing shadow as they rolled down the still streets toward home. The air was sharp when Jack stepped out of the truck, the front yard glistening faintly with dew. The house stood perfectly still at the end of the street, the morning light brushing its white walls, giving it the illusion of peace. But peace, he thought, was only what things looked like from far away. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of lemon cleaner mixed with the sweetness of Marilyn's perfume, an echo of her presence, staged and sterile. The table was still scattered with broken dishes from the night before, the floor faintly streaked from where Emily's small hands had tried to clean it. Jack stood for a long moment, staring at the place that had once been his sanctuary, and realized that what he feared most was not what he might find, but what he already knew. He walked into the living room, the boards creaking softly under his boots. On the corner desk lay a pile of unopened mail, envelopes yellowed, stacked neatly, as if waiting for someone who would never come. He sat down and tore the first one open. The county seal stared back at him in red ink. Notice of mortgage transfer. He blinked, reading it again. The signature at the bottom was his, but it wasn't. The handwriting was too smooth, too deliberate. He opened another envelope. Final reminder, payment past due. His pulse slowed to a steady beat, his training keeping his movements calm even as his heart raced. He opened a third, an urgent warning about pending foreclosure. The pieces fit together too cleanly to be coincidence. Jack rose, staring at the house around him. He had left this place standing proud, safe, built on the idea that it would never crumble as long as he worked hard enough. Now it felt like standing in a structure already half claimed by decay. Rex moved toward him, ears alert, his tail brushing the floor in a slow rhythm as if to remind his master to stay grounded. Jack exhaled and crossed to the small desk in the corner where an old desktop computer hummed faintly in sleep mode. He brushed the dust from its screen, woke it up, and logged into the joint account he hadn't checked in weeks. The numbers appeared slowly, glowing in the pale light from the window. The balance was low, shockingly low. The list of recent transactions scrolled across the screen in a pattern too polished to be random. Beauty spas in Seattle, luxury hotels in Portland, bars, jewelry boutiques, and car rentals. Thousands, gone in weeks. His eyes narrowed at a line marked private transport service. Then another, exclusive retreat. And another, Bellevue Spa, premium package. The words blurred for a second before refocusing, and the truth settled in. He wasn't just reading carelessness, he was reading choice. A choice to abandon, to indulge, to erase the life they had built in quiet betrayal. He picked up his phone and called the bank. A polite voice answered, a man with a calm, practiced tone that made the words feel heavier. Yes, sir, the withdrawals were authorized under Mrs. Carter's name. The signatures and access match perfectly. No signs of fraud have been detected. Jack's jaw tightened. The man continued to explain, but the words fell like static, impersonal, detached. Everything is in order. That phrase stayed in his mind long after he hung up. Everything was in order, except the family that order was meant to protect. Rex's low bark broke the stillness. The dog stood by the old oak cabinet in the corner, one paw tapping at the bottom drawer. Jack knelt beside him and pulled it open. Inside were neatly folded bills, outdated manuals, and under them, a hidden envelope, heavy with paper. He slid it out and unfolded the contents. Debt collection notice. Another one followed. Final warning. The total due was circled in red, a number that twisted his stomach. He stared at the dates, weeks old. Marilyn had received them, hidden them, and gone about her life without a word. Jack sank onto the floor, the papers crumpling in his hands. For a moment, the house was so quiet that the ticking of the clock in the hallway sounded like a countdown. When he finally stood, he turned toward the small security monitor mounted near the TV. He hadn't looked at it since installing it months ago. Just one of those precautions meant for safety, not suspicion. The screen flickered to life, and the footage began to play. He fast-forwarded through the days, watching time slip by in a blur of shadows and light. Then he saw them. Emily, moving through the kitchen, tiny shoulders squared under the weight of Jonah in her arms. Emily, standing on tiptoe to reach the counter. Emily, wiping the floor, her hair falling across her face. Hour after hour. Marilyn never appeared, not once. Jack sat motionless, his face reflected faintly in the dark glass of the screen when he paused the recording. The truth was a wound without blood, a quiet slice that hurt deeper because it made no sound. He watched a few more seconds, saw Emily look up suddenly at a noise, her face tired but cautious, like a soldier trained to listen for danger. Then the door opened briefly. Marilyn entered, heels clicking against the floor, tossing a purse onto the couch, speaking to no one. Within minutes, she was gone again. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. He rose, moved through the house like a man retracing a battlefield. Upstairs, the bedroom smelled faintly of perfume, the kind that lingered too long. The vanity was cluttered with half-used makeup, receipts from boutiques, and an empty jewelry box. A photo sat on the dresser. Emily at 5, missing a front tooth, smiling beside Marilyn's carefully poised figure. Jack turned it face down. On the nightstand, a leather-bound notebook lay open, initials MS stamped in gold. Inside were scribbled appointments, spa schedules, and transfers. One note underlined twice. Bellevue Retreat, confirm deposit. He stared at it until the words lost shape, until they became only symbols for something that could no longer be fixed. The morning light had brightened by the time Jack returned downstairs, but it brought no warmth. The house, stripped of illusion, looked smaller now, beautiful on the outside, empty within. He stood in the doorway of the living room, Rex beside him, both facing the quiet space that had once echoed with laughter. The line between duty and love, he thought, had blurred long before this day. He pulled his phone from his pocket and opened the last message from his commanding officer. His thumbs hovered for a moment before typing 2 words, taking leave. He pressed send, the decision solid as stone. He crossed to the kitchen and paused by the refrigerator. A drawing was still taped there, Emily's, done in crayon, faded at the edges. A bright yellow sun, a house, and 3 stick figures holding hands. He traced one of the figures lightly with his finger. "This is what matters," he whispered, though no one was there to hear it. Rex lifted his head, tail flicking once as if he understood. Jack straightened, took one last look around the hollow home, and felt a strange calm settle in his chest. Whatever battles awaited beyond this moment, they would be fought here, within these walls. The mission was no longer about service or survival. It was about protection, about reclaiming what had been nearly lost to silence. By the time evening fell over Willow Creek, the sky had turned the color of tarnished brass, and the air outside hummed faintly with the sound of cicadas hidden in the trees. Jack stood by the window of the hospital room, watching the faint rhythm of headlights weaving through the distant streets. Emily was sitting upright on the bed, a soft band around her lower back, her small hand clutching a cup of warm milk. Jonah slept peacefully beside her in a portable crib, his tiny chest rising and falling in the gentle rhythm of an undisturbed dream. The doctor had just returned with a calm smile, confirming that both children were strong enough to go home that night. Jack nodded quietly, his relief visible only in the slow exhale he didn't realize he'd been holding. When Emily looked up at him with a faint smile, something within him eased, a promise silently kept between father and child. The drive home was long, though the distance was short. The world outside had turned a deep indigo, the moon slicing through clouds as if it were afraid to look too closely at the house they were approaching. Emily sat in the back seat, Eyes heavy but awake, Rex curled beside her, his head resting protectively near her knees. Jack glanced in the mirror and caught her reflection, pale, tired, but safe. That was all that mattered. When they reached home, he carried Jonah inside, the small bundle sleeping soundly in his arms. The house was silent, the faint smell of stale perfume still clinging to the air, but he ignored it. He settled the baby in his crib, tucked Emily into her bed, and watched as Rex lay at her feet, eyes half closed yet alert, the quiet guardian of the family's uneasy peace. For the first time in weeks, the house felt almost like it belonged to them again. Jack moved through each room with careful steps, shutting windows, turning off the hum of unnecessary lights. In the soft glow of the lamp near the couch, he sat for a moment, elbows on his knees, head bowed. The faint ticking of the wall clock seemed too loud. He looked around, at the small shoes by the door, the folded blanket on the armchair, the half-finished glass of milk Emily had left on the counter. These ordinary details carried a fragile kind of hope, the kind that trembled under the weight of exhaustion but refused to break. He leaned back, whispering almost unconsciously, "We're home now." The peace didn't last long. The next afternoon, when the light began to soften again toward dusk, Jack heard the screech of tires outside, followed by the unmistakable thud of a car door slammed too hard. Rex lifted his head first, ears pricking, a low rumble building in his throat. Jack rose slowly, heart tightening. A moment later, the front door swung open, and Marilyn stumbled in, her perfume sharp enough to fill the entire hallway. She was 38, striking in a practiced way, her once controlled composure replaced by the careless glamour of someone who had lived too many nights out. Her eyes were glassy, rimmed with smudged mascara, and her high heels clicked unevenly against the wooden floor. "So," she said, voice slurred but defiant, "the hero's home." Jack stood still, hands at his sides, his voice calm but steady. "Where have you been?" he asked, the words simple but edged with restraint. Marilyn laughed, a brittle, hollow sound that echoed too loud in the quiet house. "Where have you been, Jack? Off playing soldier while I handle everything?" She kicked off her shoes, staggered toward the kitchen, and reached for the wine bottle on the counter. Rex moved closer to Jack's leg, growling softly. The air seemed to thicken between them, every breath carrying the weight of months unspoken. Jack followed her into the kitchen, his tone still measured. "I saw the accounts," he said. "The house, the money, the spa, the hotels. You mortgaged the house, Marilyn. You hid the debt." Her hand froze mid-air, the wineglass trembling slightly before she set it down. For a brief second, the mask cracked. Surprise, then fear, then defiance returning twice as sharp. "You weren't here," she spat. "You were never here. You think throwing money at this family makes you a father?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke, filling every corner of the room. Jack's reply came low, quiet. "You left them alone." That broke whatever fragile control was left. Marilyn slammed the glass down, shards scattering across the counter. "Don't you dare judge me," she hissed. "You chose your missions over us. You're always out saving someone else while I'm stuck here." The words slurred together, but their venom was clear. Jack didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "I chose to serve," he said. "You chose to disappear." For a moment, neither moved. The silence stretched, the tension winding tighter until it felt like the room itself would break. From down the hallway came a small sound, the creak of a door, the shuffle of small feet against the floor. Emily appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide, one arm holding Jonah close against her chest. The baby stirred, his tiny cry rising just above the hum of the refrigerator. "Daddy," she whispered, voice trembling, "please don't let her make us stay with her." The words struck harder than any argument could. Marilyn turned, startled, but the look in Emily's eyes stopped her cold. It wasn't anger, it was fear. Real, quiet, deep fear. Jack's body went rigid, the final line between patience and resolve crossing in a heartbeat. He moved to Emily, knelt down, and gently took Jonah from her arms. "Go to your room, sweetheart," he said softly. "You and your brother will be all right." She hesitated, then nodded, retreating down the hallway with Rex following close behind, his presence steady as stone. Jack stood again, facing Marilyn. The distance between them felt larger than the room. "This ends tonight," he said. "You can pack your things or I can call someone to do it for you, but you're leaving." Marilyn's face twisted, torn between rage and disbelief. "You can't do that," she snapped. "This is my home too." Jack's expression didn't change. Not anymore. His voice was quiet, almost too quiet, but it carried the weight of something final. For a moment, she looked as if she might argue again, but then her gaze flicked toward the hallway where the faint sound of Emily's sobs could still be heard. Whatever she saw there, the fear, the truth, the consequence, drained the last of her resistance. She grabbed her purse from the counter, muttering curses under her breath, and pushed past him toward the door. The latch clicked shut behind her, leaving only silence in her wake. Jack stood still for a long time, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirp of crickets outside, the only sounds left. The smell of spilled wine and broken glass hung in the air, sharp and sour. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Then he turned off the lights, checked on Emily and Jonah, both asleep now, Rex curled protectively near the crib, and sat down at the kitchen table. The laptop lay open, the glow of the screen faint against the dark. He typed the words carefully, methodically, as if they were part of a report he'd written 100 times before. Emergency custody protection order. Then he signed his name. When he closed the computer, the night was still. He leaned back, the faint ache in his chest spreading like a slow burn. Outside, a light breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the distant echo of something new. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of it. Jack rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the rough edge of fatigue give way to something steadier, something resolute. Upstairs, Emily stirred once in her sleep, her small hand reaching out until it found the warmth of Rex's fur. The house, for the first time in a long while, was quiet. Not the silence of fear, but of survival. Morning came softly over Willow Creek, spilling pale light across the rooftops and the quiet curve of the street. The air carried the scent of cut grass and the faraway hum of a train rolling through the valley. Inside the small suburban house, sunlight touched the walls in warm, forgiving tones, and Jack stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled to his elbows, staring at a bottle of formula and a pot of water as if they were tactical gear for a mission he didn't remember training for. Rex lay nearby, tail flicking lazily against the tile, watching his owner with that quiet patience only an old German shepherd could possess. Jack exhaled, measured the milk again, and poured it wrong. Half of it splashed across the counter. He laughed under his breath, the sound unfamiliar but genuine, and muttered, "We'll get there, buddy." Emily's small footsteps approached, light but certain. Her hair hung in loose strands, framing her pale face still soft from sleep. Her eyes carried that mix of caution and kindness that children learn too early when life asks them to grow up fast. She climbed onto a chair to reach the counter, moving with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times. "You're supposed to shake it first, Dad," she said quietly, without looking up. Jack watched her hands, steady, practiced, and something in his chest twisted. "That's my job now," he said gently, taking the bottle from her fingers. She hesitated, as if unsure whether to let go. Then, slowly, she nodded and stepped back, folding her hands behind her back. The rest of the morning unfolded in awkward rhythm. Jack burned the toast, forgot to burp Jonah after feeding him, dropped a dish, and almost tripped over Rex, who had planted himself like a furry shadow beside the crib. But there was laughter now, the kind that sneaks back into a house like light finding cracks through old curtains. Emily laughed when he tried to fold the baby blanket and ended up tangling himself instead. Rex barked once, wagging his tail as if approving the sound. Jack stood in the middle of the kitchen, holding the warm bottle in one hand and a towel in the other, and for the first time in years, the silence in his home felt kind instead of heavy. As days passed, a new pattern began to take shape. Jack started waking up early, not because duty demanded it, but because the sound of Jonah's cries felt like a call he wanted to answer. He learned to measure formula without spilling, to rock the baby until his tiny hand unclenched in sleep, and to hum the same tune Emily once sang to calm her brother. The first time he managed to make breakfast without burning anything, Emily clapped her hands softly from the table, eyes shining. "See, I told you you'd learn," she said. Jack smiled. Guess I had a good teacher. She looked away shyly but couldn't hide her grin. Rex had his own duties, self-assigned and unwavering. He followed Jack through every room, lay beside Jonah's crib whenever the baby slept, and positioned himself by the front door each evening, head resting on his paws like a sentinel. When Emily played in the living room, Rex kept his eyes fixed on her, every sound outside triggering the slight lift of his ears. Once, when a delivery man knocked unexpectedly, Rex stood between Emily and the door until Jack appeared, calm and alert, but ready. In that small household, the dog became more than a pet. He was a presence, steady, loyal, silent proof that safety could still exist. One quiet afternoon, sunlight filtered through the curtains, painting golden stripes across the floor. Jack was scrubbing the kitchen counter, sleeves damp, when Emily appeared with a basket of laundry. I can do this part, she said. I used to. He stopped her with a look that wasn't stern, just certain. You used to because you had to, he said softly. Now you don't. She stood still for a moment, eyes flicking toward the sink as if weighing whether to argue. Then she nodded, set the basket down, and sat at the table, her hands fiddling with the hem of her shirt. Jack kept cleaning, not to fill the silence, but to let it stretch naturally between them. It was the kind of quiet that mended things. That night, after Jonah had fallen asleep, Jack went through the house with a large cardboard box. He started in the bedroom. Marilyn's perfumes, the high heels abandoned by the door, the framed photo with her practiced smile. Each item he placed in the box felt like lifting a weight off his chest. He didn't curse or linger. He simply removed what no longer belonged. Emily peeked from the hallway, holding her sketchbook to her chest. Are you mad at her? She asked. Jack looked at the box for a long moment before answering. No, he said. I'm just making space. By the end of the week, the house had changed in small but unmistakable ways. The sharp smell of perfume was gone, replaced by the faint aroma of coffee and baby powder. The dining room table had crayons scattered across its surface, and the once closed blinds now let the morning light pour in freely. Jack painted the living room walls in a softer color, mended the railing on the porch, and built a small play corner near the window for Emily. When the work was done, he stood back, hands on his hips, watching his daughter draw beside the window. Her small shoulders were relaxed, her laughter unguarded. He thought to himself that maybe rebuilding didn't start with hammers and paint. It started when a child felt safe enough to laugh again. Emily began to fill the walls with her drawings, simple at first, then brighter, fuller. One showed Rex with a superhero cape, another Jonah in his crib surrounded by stars. But one morning, Jack noticed a new drawing on the fridge, a family of 3 holding hands under a wide blue sky, with the words, "Our Home," written in uneven letters below. He stood before it for a long time, feeling something swell quietly inside him. When Emily noticed him looking, she said quickly, "I can add more if you want." He shook his head and smiled. "It's perfect." Sometimes at night, when the house had gone still, Jack would sit on the porch with Rex beside him, the cool air brushing against his face. The street was calm, the world outside quiet. Through the window, he could see Emily asleep, Jonah breathing softly in his crib. He thought about how strange it was that healing didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, gentle and persistent, through laughter, through spilled milk, through drawings taped on a fridge. He looked at Rex and murmured, "We're finally getting it right, aren't we?" The dog's tail brushed once against his boot, a silent yes. The sky above Willow Creek shimmered in the calm brightness of early spring, soft clouds drifting like thoughts half-formed over rooftops washed clean by rain. The air held that tender stillness that comes after a long season of storms. Inside the house, sunlight spread across the wooden floors and touched the small details that now defined their lives. Emily's watercolor brushes drying by the sink, Jonah's toys scattered beneath the window, Rex asleep near the back door with his muzzle resting on his paws. Jack stood at the kitchen counter, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands, watching the quiet rhythm of the morning unfold. It had taken months of slow work to reach this kind of peace, not the absence of pain, but the ability to live alongside it. When the letter from his unit came offering another assignment, Jack read it twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside. There was a time when orders had given his life meaning, but that time had passed. He had already made his choice. That week, he filed for long-term leave, turned in his uniform, and signed the papers that would mark the beginning of something entirely new. He called it the Willow Creek Shield, a foundation for children who had known the kind of fear that hides behind closed doors, and for parents trying to build safety from the ruins of their mistakes. The name came easily. The purpose came from what he'd lived. When the first local newspaper wrote about it, the headline read, "A soldier's second mission begins at home." The office was small, just a refurbished corner space on Main Street with wide windows that caught the morning light. Emily helped choose the color for the walls, pale blue, because she said it felt like breathing. At 8 years old, she had already become the foundation's youngest assistant. Every week she brought her paintings, soft images of sunlight, trees, and families holding hands, and hung them in the lobby. Visitors often stopped to admire them, not knowing they were drawn by a child who once hid from storms of her own. Jack would watch from the doorway, listening to her quiet explanations about each piece. "This one," she'd say, "is called Safe Place." And somehow, those 2 words carried more weight than any speech he could give. Jonah, now a sturdy toddler with a mop of brown curls and an infectious laugh, spent his days toddling between the office and the park. He'd wave at strangers with the easy trust of a child who had never learned fear, and that alone was enough to make Jack believe in small miracles. Rex, faithful as ever, had become something of a local legend. A photographer from the town's newspaper had once snapped a picture of him lying beside Jonah's crib, his great head resting protectively near the baby's arm. That single image spread faster than Jack expected, first across Willow Creek, then to neighboring towns, and eventually online, where thousands of strangers left messages, calling Rex a hero. A month later, the county police honored him as an honorary retired K-9, draping a small medal over his collar. Jack had smiled quietly through the ceremony, watching Emily clap the loudest in the crowd. The foundation grew faster than Jack imagined. Calls began coming from neighboring towns, then from across the state. Volunteers filled the once-empty office. Teachers, counselors, and even other veterans offered to help. But through it all, he kept the heart of the work simple. No matter how large it became, every child who walked through that door would be greeted by warmth, safety, and a story of hope. On one wall hung a framed photograph, not of medals or ceremonies, but of 3 simple things: Emily's first drawing of their home, Rex's paw print stamped in ink, and a quote Jack had written underneath, "You protect what you love by learning how to stay." One quiet afternoon, as Jack reviewed documents by the office window, his assistant buzzed in to say there was a visitor waiting. The name made him pause. Marilyn Carter. For a long time, he said nothing. The air around him seemed to still, as though the past had stepped just beyond the threshold. When he finally agreed to see her, he found a woman changed, older, thinner, her once sharp confidence replaced by the cautious humility of someone who had lost more than she realized. She didn't sit down right away, just stood with her hands clasped, eyes lowered. "I just wanted to see Emily," she said softly. "I don't expect her to forgive me. I only want to know she's all right." Jack studied her for a long moment. The anger he once felt had long since cooled into something quieter, heavier, but no longer sharp. "She's doing better than all right," he said finally, his voice even. "She's painting again, laughing again. She's safe." Marilyn nodded, tears catching at the corner of her eyes. "Then that's all I needed to know." When she turned to leave, Jack added gently, "She deserves peace, not the echoes of what hurt her." Marilyn stopped in the doorway, hesitated, then whispered, "Thank you for giving her that." He didn't answer, and she didn't look back. The door closed softly behind her. Later that evening, Jack drove home under the fading light. The town was quiet, the street lamps flickering to life one by one. He parked the truck and stood for a while, watching the windows of his house glowing warm against the dark. Inside, Emily was on the floor, working on a new painting while Jonah scribbled beside her with a crayon. Rex lay stretched out beside them, eyes half closed but alert, every inch of him the quiet guardian he had always been. Jack leaned against the doorway, letting the sight sink into him. There was no perfection here, no grand triumph, no redemption that erased what had come before. But there was peace, fragile and real, built from the small, steady moments that had replaced the chaos. He joined them on the floor, pretending to critique Emily's painting, until she laughed and accused him of knowing nothing about art. Jonah crawled onto his lap, clutching a stuffed toy soldier, and Rex wagged his tail once before resting his head on Jack's knee. "You know," Jack said softly, "this might be the best mission I've ever had." Emily looked up, smiling. "You mean us?" He nodded. "Yeah, you." The words hung there, simple but true, and Emily leaned against him without answering. The night deepened quietly, the hum of life within the walls unbroken. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees, carrying the faint scent of lilac and the distant sound of wind chimes. Jack stepped out to the backyard for a moment, the old wooden deck cool under his feet. The garden was bathed in silver light. Emily joined him, Jonah in her arms, Rex trotting close behind. Together they stood in the soft hush of the evening, the glow from the kitchen windows wrapping around them like an embrace. Jack placed his hand gently on Emily's shoulder, the warmth of her small frame grounding him in the present. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to explain. Rex settled at their feet. Jonah reached toward the stars, and Emily tilted her face up to the sky. Jack looked at them, 3 lives once fractured, now whole again, and realized that this was what home truly meant. Not walls, not photographs, not even safety. It was the act of choosing every day to stay and to love in the quiet after the storm. The wind rustled the trees one last time before settling into stillness. Behind them, the light from the house glowed steady and soft, a small beacon in the town of Willow Creek, where 4 souls had finally learned what it meant to be whole. Sometimes, the quietest people carry the deepest strength. The ones who never ask to be seen are often those who hold everything together when the world forgets. Love doesn't always roar. It often works in silence, in late nights and small acts of kindness that no one applauds. And maybe that's what keeps this world turning. The unseen courage, the loyal hearts, the people and creatures who give more than they take. If this story touched you in some small way, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what you felt, what you remembered, or simply who you're grateful for today. Subscribe if you wish to walk with us through more stories of compassion and quiet heroism. And may God bless you and your loved ones wherever you are tonight.